Well, I've enjoyed being taken back to places I love, and today's a bit different because I'm even going to show you things I've never seen, and I spent a lot of time trying to find photographs of the latest thing, but I more or less got it together. It may be a bit chaotic, but we'll hope for the best. Just to remind you what we've been through, we have seen the Pantheon in Rome, and don't forget that the Pantheon is a revolutionary domed structure, but the facade looks like a traditional temple, and that thing's been hanging around ever since then, though slightly less nowadays than in the last century. And then here's the interior of that, and the wonderful Church of the Holy Wisdom, Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, and with this gorgeous interior, and look how the light floods in through so many small windows. Byzantine architecture is mysterious and subtle, and when possible covered with mosaics. And then we saw Ottoman mosques. This is the Süleymaniye Mosque, the largest in Istanbul, except the one built by the present Prime Minister, Erdogan. And it has gorgeous domes and half domes up above. And then we moved on to Brunelleschi. How on earth could anyone build a dome on a medieval cathedral with a huge opening which has not been... Oh, right. Okay. So here's Brunelleschi wondering, but succeeding in figuring out how to put a dome on this huge open space without having to build formwork out of wood, without having to build a sort of negative of the dome and then put stone on it. So this was a great moment in architecture. And then we came to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and Wren loved to make things complicated, so he had an inner dome, which is perhaps more in tune with people down below, and an upper dome, which is high on the city skyline, as you see, and then above that, the lantern, which rests on a huge brick cone. And then I slid by the American Capitol rather briefly, and let's move on to something which is probably familiar to us all, the dome, the Capitol in Olympia, built, not finished until 1928, so less than a century ago, and it still has a dome. The dome was the ultimate symbol for an important building, whether it be a government building or religious building. The dome proclaimed it, and then, in case there was any doubt, putting a Roman temple front on the facade just let you know which way you go in, and a few other important things. You're supposed to see this with admiration and pride in your own state, because it has a temple portico. Well, did those continue into the 18th century? Sorry, the 20th century? Well, just before we get to the 20th century, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago was a great occasion. People went to it from all over the world, from every state in this country, and they were absolutely amazed by what they saw. Louis Sullivan, the leader of the modern architects in Chicago, was absolutely disappointed, because he said this will put back the course of modern architecture for 50 years. And people were so excited by the World's Columbian Exposition that that's just about what happened. Well, since we're dealing with modernism, we better get the theory straight right from the very beginning. So here's Louis Sullivan, who I was just mentioning. Form ever follows function, and this is the law. Going back a bit, this is actually a Gothic revival architect in England, but he believed in truth in architecture. There should be no features about a building that are not necessary for convenience, construction, or propriety. The smallest detail should serve a purpose. And then Corbu, as we called him, when I was in architecture school, we were so excited that Corbu had come along. Architecture has nothing to do with the various styles. The styles of Louis XIV, XV, XVI, or Gothic are to architecture what a feather is on a woman's hat. It is sometimes pretty, but not always, and never anything more. The engineer, inspired by the law of economy and governed by mathematical calculation, puts us in accord with universal law. He achieves harmony. That was 1923, and he meant it. Well, we've better architecture is the art of organizing space. It is expressed by construction. Very important. And then Frank Lloyd Wright. Here's a more general statement. There is nothing more uncommon than common sense, but he believed in common sense in architecture. He saw architecture as the mother of all art. And he felt that there had to be an American architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. And he meant it too. Of course, the first building he built was not a large building that ever could have had a dome. It was a house. And this is actually just his idea for a house published in a magazine in 1901. And see how horizontal it is. It seems to spread out on the land. And it rises up in the middle, and light comes into the living room from above. And moving to another house just a year later, this is the Ward Willett's house in Highland Park where he lived. And if a house is a box, what's happened to it? It's exploded. I think somebody talked about the explosion of the box. I'm not sure if it was Frank Lloyd Wright, but he certainly pulled it off. And the house spread over the land in this extraordinary way. Perhaps his most famous house, the Roby House in Chicago, 1906, has this tremendous long roof which spreads out over a terrace in front. So you can sit up here sheltered from the sun or the rain, and there's another big overhang at the balcony from the master bedroom. And then look at the chimney. The hearth is the center of the home, which seems to tether the house to the ground. Now we'll get to one building that could have had a dome. This is the church, and he built in his community, the Unity Temple, which I suppose was the Unitarian church. And he didn't need to build a dome because he could bring the light in high up underneath this overhanging roof to keep the hot sun out, but to let the light in. But then, furthermore, he let light in through the ceiling, subdued light, so we could see our hymn books easily. So Wright wasn't thinking about conventions of domes. He was thinking about light, and some domes brought in practically no light. Another building that Wright designed, which was really remarkable, the Johnson's Wax Building in Racine, Wisconsin. He called it the Cathedral of Work. He made the workspace for all the people who had to be there for hours and hours every day delightful by having light coming down under these giant mushrooms, bringing in with light coming in the spaces between them. And there, oh yeah, oh, so you haven't seen this one, sorry. So this is the way the light comes in between giant mushrooms. Who needs a dome when they've got that? And there he's testing one of those. Of course, there were naysayers who said those things will never stand. So they're piling bags of sand on it until it collapses. And jumping a few years, Wright designed the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which has a shallow dome at the top of a high space. When we see it from the street, we can see that there's a spiral. People move around the spiral, gradually discovering works of art as they go. Not a bad idea. And then we come into this interior space lit from above, and we can see the people walking around it. There are small galleries all the way around where the pictures are placed. Sometimes I thought, I want to stand back a bit more, and then I wondered if I would fall over backwards over the handrail, but I managed not to. But it is an ingenious way. You know how you go to an art gallery and you get into one room and you think, well, I want to see the Impressionists next, and you go this way, but it leads you back to a century, and so on. So rather than wandering aimlessly from room to room, you take the elevator to the top, and then you come down gradually. And there is the dome, a shallow glass dome lighting the entire interior space. So he's not thinking of a dome as something on the skyline to draw the public in from a distance, but as a way of illuminating the interior gracefully. And then we can look down. Now, I will be bringing in some things, since we're dealing with the modern world, that have nothing to do with domes, but I felt it was right to put in Mies van der Rohe, the German architect, who designed this pavilion for World's Fair in Barcelona in 1928, the German pavilion. And you can see that there's nothing but horizontal and vertical planes. And the plan seems to show just a few planes standing up. And when we get into it, we see how transparent the outer walls are and how the partitions are just to divide spaces. And this is a house that he built in Czechoslovakia, very much in the same way, and it has glass all around it on 3 sides. So the building has become transparent, and that was one of the themes of modernism, transparency and light. Wright brought in a subtle light. Mies van der Rohe brought in a lot of light. Well, now what I'm going to show you is in no particular order, and they're all things that have been built in mostly from the middle of the 20th century. This was a sports palace in Rome, the Palazzo dello Sport, built for the 1960 Olympics. They actually built 2 buildings, designed 2 buildings for this. and this is one of them. The other, I just show a drawing of part of it. But look how, think of the Pantheon with its walls thick, 16 feet thick of solid bricks, though, as Grant pointed out, there were recesses in it, which reduced the weight a bit. But instead of being buttressed by an immense amount of weight, it's supported on the most slender Y-shaped members of precast concrete, which could be lifted up with a crane and put in place, and then the roof spread across between them. And it's a very, very thin shell. There are precast concrete sections that go together, and when we look up, well, let's look at this one first. This is the structure, how incredibly light it is. And there's, remember Le Corbusier talking about the engineer having economy and reason, not just tons and tons of concrete like the Pantheon. So that's the crowd underneath that dome in the Palazzo dello Sport. Now I'm going to move to Mexico, to a great architect and engineer named Felix Candela. I remember I went to his office when I was in Mexico City and got a plan, a map that showed all his buildings. So I went and visited, quite a lot of them, and especially this one. But it's about the only one I'll show. And I later heard him give a lecture, and he said at the end of the Spanish Civil War, he was leaving the country and getting on a boat. He didn't even know where he was going. And people were, there were several boats. People called out names. And the name came, Candela, Mexico. They need a lot of builders there. And so that's what he became. And he became a pioneer of thin shell structures. That almost looks as if it's made out of paper or fabric. It's so thin. And it wasn't easy to build. I think he succeeded with structures like this because there was cheap labor and lots of it. So it was well, first let's look at the inside. It is a dome, but it doesn't have a smooth surface. There are creases in it. And then the next picture shows if you want to build a thin shell like that, you need an awful lot of carpenters and an awful lot of pieces of wood, little pieces of wood, which you somehow manage to hammer together and then put a substructure over it. And then the next one shows the laborers carrying up buckets of concrete on their shoulders and emptying them onto the formwork, which has a mesh of steel on it. And the amazing thing is that this shell is only about 6 inches thick. And it's amazing that it was very precise. The steel was very precisely placed, and then the concrete was smoothed out and had at least 2 inches of cover over the steel. And I wonder how well they have fared. But I found some interesting evidence on that a little bit later. So there's Felix Candela using concrete to make thin shells. And then this is quite out of place. And it seems that everybody thought so. Here we know what this is. I should have brought a picture of it exploding or whatever it did. But you know that if you didn't see it, you heard it.
picture.
Yeah, Susan found the picture for me. Well, what other sort of domes were there? Can anyone think of a name of an eccentric person whose name is connected to domes? Geodesic domes? Buckminster Fuller, yes. Bucky, yes. I once went to a lecture by him, and after it was over, somebody asked how long it lasted, and I said, oh, about 4 hours. He said, oh, you were lucky. When I went, it was 6. He was a man who had a bee in his bonnet, and that was to make life as efficient as possible. And he thought that structures were built in a very wasteful way. We could use far less material. And he built the Dymaxion house of Buckminster Fuller, which was a house just built in. Oh, wait a minute, I still haven't got to the right picture. Here's one of Buckminster Fuller's shallower domes. This one, I think, is in Australia, and the next one is in Canada. He built many of these. He got the system down to something that was really understood, and they could be manufactured out of multiple parts that were all the same. Think how many different components you put in the average building. This one has about one repeated many, many times. And he built them all over the place. I'm sure I want to say more about Buckminster Fuller. What should I say?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like there's any interior in this building.
I was looking for one that had more interior, but I couldn't find one with a good enough, higher enough resolution in the picture. You could climb up onto that thing, maybe take an elevator and feel the great expanse of it. And then, of course, there's this. And it's the only one I haven't put the architect's name. Does anyone know who built this?
Jeff Bezos. Well, that's not the architect.
Susan and I did visit it one time. We had a friend who was working there as artist in residence, and he had a little studio. And if any of the employees was tired of working, they could go and do a little bit of art, and our friend would pat them on the back. But he took us into the spheres, and I wish I had my own. I couldn't scan my slides quickly enough, but the beautiful little places where you can sit under a bower of vegetation on soft mossy grass with your computer, with your laptop computer, and feel productive. I do it all the time. Now, another architect and engineer I wanted to talk about was Santiago Calatrava, who did a lot of interesting stuff in Spain early on. And again, I haven't seen his buildings, and I didn't have my own pictures, and I couldn't find suitable pictures that could be reproduced because they were too low resolution. But I've heard some of a more recent place of the city of art and science, Valencia. Has anyone been to Valencia? Ah, did you go recently enough to see this? Quite a while ago. Ah, well, Valencia is a fascinating city to which I haven't been, but in it there's on a sort of inlet from the sea, there's a huge collection of museum buildings which are dedicated to Queen Sophia of Greece. And I brought this in because I was at school with her, and when the art master was sick for a few weeks, I was asked to teach his class. So I was drawing master to the Queen of Spain, and I'm sure I instilled on her this love of art, which made her want to patronize this amazing collection of museums. I couldn't find any interior pictures, but it's really quite extraordinary. There's several buildings, and here in the twilight we see a group of them all together, and there's also a Calatrava bridge. Calatrava built a lot of bridges like the one in the background here, with wires going down to hold up the bridge from this support. I want to go and see it. I'm lost. I can't quite figure it out, but it's energetic. It's full of movement, and I think it would be worth seeing. But you don't have to go to Valencia to see Calatrava's work. If you think this is a great white dove about to take to the air, you're almost there. This is at the World Trade Center. It's called the Oculus, which is an odd name for it. The light comes in a slit down the middle between the wings, but it's not like the Oculus of the Pantheon. But this, the purpose of this, I think, is to produce a piece of urban sculpture that makes him famous. That's what architects like to do. But it brings together a rail line and the subway, and right near the entrance of the World Trade Center. And I'm planning to go and see it in a couple of weeks. I hope you'll spare the time, Susan. Here's another view of it. The bird has rotated a little bit. And then this is underneath it. It hasn't actually, doesn't actually have an oculus, which I think should be round, but it's a great high space full of light into which people come from various transportation directions before moving up above ground. Well, back to old classical buildings. And this was an old classical building where a fire was started, I think on the orders of Hitler, though he said it was done by the communists, who might not have wanted a parliament. So it's got all the hallmarks of a neoclassical building of the 19th century, except the dome was solid structure, not glass. And it has the temple front, which, as we've said, is a symbol of anything we want it to be. And of course, it is decorated with sculpture which speaks of the glories of the Reich, or of the Deutschen Völker. While I was putting these together, I saw that the next picture, which is the carving of one of the capitals of the original building, which reminds us how different building is today. So there's the sculpture in the pediment and some flamboyant excrescences above. I'm not quite sure what they represent. And then above that, glass. And the public could go up onto the roof, stroll around onto the roof, or in under this structure, and they could climb up around a spiraling ramp on the under the glass dome and look down, and from some places they can look down on the people sitting below in the legislative chamber. This was designed by Norman Foster, the British architect Norman Foster. He became Sir Norman, and now he's Lord Foster, so he's moving along with his glass dome. Very ingenious. But what I didn't mention was that Calatrava, who designed those other things we saw just before, entered the competition for the Reichstag and also came up with a glass roof. He had a glass roof for the whole building, virtually, and the legislative chamber was illuminated from a whole glass dome. It was maybe a bit too much light. Anyway, Foster got the job. I like this view because it somehow tells us that we can climb up to that and get an incredible view of Berlin, or look down at the people climbing up, and through small opening like this at the legislative chamber below. You can also walk around on the floor down here and lean over and see down into there. So that was really an extraordinary restoration of the purpose of the building, but bringing it up to date and making it more transparent. Don't we want government to be transparent? Now, is this a dome? Or is it just a dome that's been smashed up into small pieces and rearranged in some fashion? There was, as you'd expect, a competition for this, and with many, many entries. The professor of architecture at Cambridge, when I first went there in 1958, had just returned from judging being one of the judges of the competition, and he showed us the drawings of it. He didn't seem to be particularly interested in its outward form, but there were some things that he really admired in the circulation, the way you moved through the building and so on. But anyway, there were many entries to this competition, and some people were very angry that Jorn Utzon, a Dane who hadn't built very much before, came up with this design. It gradually turned out that it was virtually unbuildable as he envisioned it. You can imagine sort of making something like that out of papier-mâché, and it would hold its shape very well. But the bigger it gets, the more problems there are involved in trying to make it stand up. And he had a very good engineer over Arup, a Danish architect with an office in London, who was responsible for many important buildings. I can't think which ones, but he was the probably leading 20th century engineer. And he was tearing out his hair. How on earth can we build this? Utzon had thought of it as a thin concrete shell like Candela built, but that was just not remotely possible. And in the end, there really is a steel frame in the middle. The price tripled, doubled, and then tripled, and people became very angry. People who thought the government should spend their money on things that were needed by the people. Who needs opera, for one thing? But apparently opera is very popular in Australia. There was a famous opera singer called Nellie Melba. I think there was another one too. But anyway, it just took a great deal of redesigning and thinking it out. I remember what my professor thought was so good, the way that you go up a steep, I think this one would be better, a steep ramp onto a high platform, and then the auditorium is partly sunk into this platform, and there's some very odd things. Where do you think that any theatre has to have a fly tower so that they can lift huge pieces of scenery easily out of the way or bring them down suddenly? Just saw that happening a couple of nights ago at the opera in Seattle. But how would you do that? And I think I'll go to this one, which shows a section. You come up the ramp on this. Here's the. I'll just go to that first. You go up the ramp. The widest, must be the widest staircase in the world, I think, and you go into an entrance which is between the two theatres, and then we'll go back. Then you walk between the two theatres. You pass the fly towers, which are in the middle of the structure, underneath this highest sail or wing or whatever you call it. And you can see that this great height thing is not necessary for what happens inside it. There's a lot of empty space between the fly tower and the structure above, but it all got solved. Oh no, I'm going back. So it is absolutely gorgeous. I've only been there once quite recently, and I don't remember thinking about everything I knew about all the troubles they've had. What I remember thinking is how dramatic it is, how wonderful in a huge harbour where you see a few sailboats, to see great wings like this, as if they would catch the wind and move through the world, propelled by the wind. A lot of people felt that Utzon really deserved to win the competition because even though he didn't have any idea how to build it, he had such an amazingly dramatic idea. So, looking at the plan, we move up the steps at the bottom of the picture and through, and then there are tiers. I think you go down a little before you. No, you don't. No, you go in. You go in here and you go on the level, and it's all steps going up inside. And Utzon was very annoyed that the auditorium differed greatly when it was finished by another architect from his idea, which I think somehow spread up into those sails up above. And the architect had no idea about acoustics. Funnily enough, there was nothing in the competition regulations, what was asked for, that dealt with acoustics. But it's pretty obvious that if you're designing an opera house, though it was intended, this is generally forgotten, to be a theatre and a symphony hall as well as an opera house. Acoustics are absolutely essential, and it was a struggle to get all of that to work. So Utzon was replaced by another architect whose name I don't know. And when I went there, I enjoyed an opera immensely. And I think that's all I have to show. But I would hope that there are some questions. Have any of you been to the Sydney Opera House?
Yes, I've seen it from the outside. Not
From the you did. Well, are there any questions or points of discussion?
Okay, let's see. Why don't you start on this side? Yes. There aren't any questions. Anybody have any questions? You have a question. Let's see who else can. There's a
Yes.
question. Of course, I have lots of questions, but I'm trying to control myself.
Thank you. I'm just curious, are most of these photos taken by you?
Well, throughout the rest of the course, most of the photos were taken by me. But I had photos of some of these buildings, but they're slides, and my slide scanner stopped working, and so I had to search the web for them, and I got some pictures, but it was a struggle. I wasn't ever sure I was going to be finished by 1 o'clock today.
They're amazing.
Are there any questions over here? On this side?
Bob.
A question?
So Henry, as we trace the dome and then these other forms into the contemporary times, what is the relationship between what we want something to look like and and how we build it? Now we can build almost anything, and how we rationalize that. And so, you know, you have Frank Gehry, and you get sort of a.
Well, have you been to the Disney Hall in
No.
Los Angeles? I've been outside it. It's terribly complicated outside, and even more complicated inside. And I think it was a real struggle. But apparently the acoustics are wonderful. My son just went to a concert a few days ago, and he said it was marvelous. But to get back to your question, the architecture is so full of symbolic features, of which the dome and the temple front are only two, but often they have nothing to do with what the building is used for.
Well, I'm thinking that it's, in a practical sense, it's almost arbitrary the way we arrive at these forms, even if the building turns out to be beautiful and treasured. And I felt a certain irony when you showed those pronouncements of the early modern Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and others, Corbu. They were all saying, well, there is basically a practical rationale for good architecture. And all of them really went way beyond that in the other direction.
Yeah, well, I didn't know quite where I was going with this lecture, and then I decided that really to get to some of these wildly inventive spaces might be the most interesting thing. But you know, well, I suppose the thing is that functional public buildings, assembly halls, and so on, could be made very useful and economical and effective and beautiful, but they didn't have to have domes to do so. And when modern architects wanted to build immensely high spaces, they often thought of other shapes. I mean, I got away with, I don't suppose I did get away with saying, well, the Sydney Opera House is a huge dome that's been smashed and rearranged, but it does have curves to it. And actually the Guggenheim Museum in New York has a shallow glass dome over the interior space, which brings in more light than a lot of domes do to the interiors of buildings. And there's nowhere in the US Capitol that has, where you can look up into a dome and see light coming down.
Thank you. I'm just curious to know whether, do you know the Marin County Frank Lloyd Wright town building?
Yes, I have. I've been there.
Yeah, I just wonder whether, while that's not a dome, there is a great deal of circular movement to it. And I was with a photography student, and we spent, I think, something like 12 hours capturing the sun coming through each one of those windows. So there was a wonderful artistic element to that, which was quite obscure.
And some of the building was underground, and some of it stood high.
Yeah, and it's in the middle of it used to be in the middle of a meadow.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the other thing is, how many times did he repeat the circular museum of that? He also had a small one in Maiden Lane in San Francisco.
Yeah, it was actually a.
How many
it was a
times did he
store.
repeat that?
It was a store.
It was a museum too.
It became a museum later.
Yeah.
I suppose it wasn't quite practical enough to work as a store.
No.
What was the name of the store? I remember. I mean, I don't remember.
It was in Maiden Lane.
Yes,
I've
absolutely.
forgotten for the moment.
Yes, it was circular, and there was a circular ramp going.
Oh no, it wasn't Gumps.
No.
No, now that would have been sensible of Gumps, but it wasn't. But how often did he repeat that particular design? Those are just two that I know of.
I can't think of any others.
Okay. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and there's one over here.
The dome is a concept which was partly a reaction to buildings that had been put up before. But if you look at the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, it seems to me that he had a completely different concept. The Guggenheim is one of the least interesting of the buildings that Wright did. I think the Roby House is an example of a beautiful house where the dome played no role whatever. And I suppose there are simply different concepts of what a building should be consisting of.
But the way that the light enters the Roby House is so comfortable and pleasant. You're right. There's not much use for domes, but see, I was going to end this with a few state capitals, and then I thought I need to go further.
It strikes me that the one building that uses the spiral in a truly functional way is our downtown library in Seattle.
Yeah.
And that, aside from all these pronouncements about form follows function, that, to me, that best expresses that principle.
Good for you. I hadn't thought of that. It's a fairly small spiral, isn't it?
Well, it's,
Yeah.
it's spread out wide enough so that
Yeah.
the rise, the grade, is very gradual.
Yes.
And but that's and at the beginning, the concept was how do you arrange books or something that's in a series or a series of series, and come up, rather than have stacks, you have a spiral, which is quite tricky to work into an otherwise horizontal.
I'd forgotten about that. It's a long time since I've been on the spiral. I have to go back. Thank you for bringing that up.
Henry, I want to thank you for this magnificent series.
Can I ask a question?
I thought we had.
Oh,
I
well,
said I had a question.
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, she has a question.
But you have such a beautiful thing to say. We'll skip my question. Go ahead.
I can't hear you. I want to thank Henry for this magnificent series on the dome, and it's been very scholarly and very entertaining. And thank you so much. And I hope you will think of us another series for next year.
If you would like that, I'd love to talk to some people who would be interested in trying to figure out what we could do.
Well, we have plenty of time to think it through, and
Yes.
and when you come up with something, we can sign up with the concierge, and get a good series of dates and a good. Is this a good time of the day for you to come? Okay, good. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming and being such a good audience, and let's give Henry a big hand.
Thank you.